The death pit was a place where no one returned. It was a sinkhole of bones, shadows, and the whispers of things that hunted in the dark. When the humans stepped to its edge, the gathered crowd only saw a man choosing his own grave. He wore no armor, carried only a blade at his side, and his eyes did not look back at those who watched him vanish into the mist below. The ground swallowed him in seconds. Loose stones slid under his boots as he descended into the fog. The air was heavy, with the smell of old blood and wet earth. Somewhere deep inside, unseen claws scraped against stone. He knew the stories said the pit was the tomb of kings and the den of monsters, but that was not why he had come. He had come because someone down there was still alive. Bones crunched underfoot as he walked further. Skulls stared at him from the dirt walls, their hollow sockets fixed in silent warning. He heard water dripping in the dark, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. He gripped the hilt of his blade, but did not draw it yet. A shadow shifted ahead, moving with unnatural grace. It was not a beast that stepped into the dim light, but a figure. A woman, but not human. Her skin was deep crimson, as if painted in the fire of a dying sun. Long black hair clung to her shoulders, and her golden eyes glowed faintly in the gloom. She wore a crown of twisted metal and bone, and her wrists were bound with chains. The human stopped, his breath quiet. This was no prisoner. This was the queen of the death pit, the one the stories had claimed was long dead. Yet she stood before him, watching with a gaze sharp enough to cut steel. "You should not be here," she said, her voice a low echo that carried through the hollow chamber. The chains clinked as she stepped closer. He did not answer. Instead, he looked at the bindings on her arms and the faint bruises around her wrists. She tilted her head, reading his silence. "Do you seek my life or my favor?" she asked. He still said nothing, only moving forward. The chains rattled louder. From the shadows behind her, movement stirred. Shapes emerged, creatures hunched and twisted, their eyes gleaming like knives in the dark. They circled slowly, claws scraping on bone. The human's hand finally drew his blade. The queen watched him as the monsters closed in. "They will not let you leave," she said. He raised his weapon in answer, stepping between her and the beasts. The first one leaped. The clash was brutal and fast. Steel tore through flesh as the human moved with precision. Each strike was clean, each step placed with deadly purpose. The beasts fought with rage, their snarls filling the cavern. Blood splashed across the stones, mixing with the dust of ages. The queen did not move, her eyes fixed on him as if weighing his worth. When the last creature fell, the pit was silent again. His breathing was steady, his grip on the blade unshaken. He stepped to her side and reached for the chains. She did not resist, only watched as he broke the bindings with a single strike of steel. Her hands were free, but she did not step away. "You are not like the others who came here," she said softly. He only glanced at her once before turning toward the way out. She followed, her crown catching the faint light, her eyes unreadable. The path back to the surface was steep, but he did not look back as they began to climb. The climb out of the pit was harder than the descent. Jagged rocks tore at his hands, and loose stones threatened to pull him back down. The queen moved. Behind him, her steps sure despite her chains having only just been removed. She did not speak, but he could feel her gaze fixed on him with a strange weight. The sunlight above was still far away. When they reached a ledge, he offered her his hand. She looked at it for a moment before taking it. Her skin was warm, almost burning to the touch, but he did not pull away. She seemed surprised he could bear it. "Most who touch me flinch," she said quietly. He did not answer, simply steadying her as she stepped onto the rock beside him. The sound of movement came from below. The man turned his head, eyes narrowing. Shadows shifted in the fog, and the faint growl of more creatures rose up to meet them. The queen glanced downward without fear. "They are not done with you," she said. He tightened his grip on his blade. The climb would now be a race. The next section of the wall was steep, but he moved quickly. The queen matched his pace. Without slowing, her bare feet gripping the stone like it was her own ground. Behind them, claws scraped against rock, getting closer. A sharp hiss cut through the air, and a black shape leapt upward, nearly reaching his leg. His blade flashed once, sending it back into the mist below. When they stopped again, she spoke. Without turning her head, "You could have left me there. Why did you not?" He kept his eyes on the path above, breathing slow and steady. "You are alive," he said simply. She gave a small sound that might have been a laugh, though it held no humor. "And so you risk yours to keep it that way," she replied. There was no question in her voice, only fact. The surface was still far. The light filtering into the pit shifted as clouds passed overhead. The human studied each handhold before moving, his strength steady. The queen followed silently for a time before speaking again. "The others who came for me sought power. Some wanted my throne, others my blood. You asked for neither. What is it you seek?" His answer was short. "To leave here alive." A narrow ridge brought them closer to the opening. The roar of the wind above reached their ears. He lifted her up first, letting her climb onto the edge. As he pulled himself after her, another creature burst from the shadows, its body covered in black scales. It lunged at her, teeth snapping, but the man was already moving. His blade met its skull in one strike, and the beast fell without another sound. They stepped out into the light together. The queen blinked against the brightness, her golden eyes narrowing. Around the rim of the pit, the crowd had gathered again, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. No one had expected to see either of them alive. The human's boots hit solid ground, and for the first time since entering, he looked around. Spears lowered slightly as he passed. The queen walked at his side, her crown catching the sunlight. She did not look at the people, only at the man who had carried her from the depths. "You are a strange one," she said. "Perhaps that is why you live where others have died." He gave no answer, his eyes fixed on the horizon. For him, the pit was behind. For her, it was only the beginning. The air outside the pit was cold and sharp. The human breathed deeply, letting the wind cut through the dust and blood that clung to his skin. The queen stood beside him, the sunlight giving her crimson skin a deeper glow. The crowd still lingered. At a distance, whispering in low voices that carried disbelief. No one approached them. The queen tilted her head toward him. "They fear you now," she said. He did not respond, only scanned the gathered faces. There was no trust here, only suspicion. He had come for a reason, and it was not to stand before a fearful crowd. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "If you wish to live in this place, you will need more than a sword." They began walking away from the pit. The onlookers parted reluctantly, making a narrow path. The queen moved, with the quiet confidence of someone who had ruled before chains had been placed on her. The man followed her lead without comment. The village beyond the pit's edge was small, its homes built from dark stone and bone. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, carrying the smell of burning oil. Children peeked from behind doorways as they passed. Their eyes were wide, not only at the human but at the queen. She seemed untouched by the attention, her gaze fixed ahead. The man noticed how every villager stepped aside quickly when she approached. Even after her captivity, her presence still commanded the air around her. He wondered how long it would be before word of her return reached those in power. They stopped at a house near the edge of the settlement. Its door was marked with carved symbols the man did not understand. The queen placed her hand on the wood, and the markings glowed faintly before fading. "This was mine," she said. Inside, the air was still and cold. Dust lay thick on every surface, but the structure was intact. She walked inside without hesitation, as if claiming it again. Man stood in the doorway, watching her move through the rooms. She touched the walls, the furniture, the windows, as if taking back pieces of herself. "You could leave now," she said without looking at him. "You have done more than anyone could ask." He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shadows. "And leave you here alone?" he asked. She turned to him with a faint smile. "I was alone before you came." They spoke little as she began clearing the dust from a long table. The man took a seat, laying his blade on the wood. He could hear the wind outside shifting through the narrow streets. "They will come for you," she said suddenly. "Those who cast me into the pit will not welcome my return." He looked at her calmly. "Then they will have to face me too," he replied. Her eyes held his for a moment before she returned to her task. As the evening deepened, a faint red glow lit the horizon. The man stepped to the window, watching the sky change. "Storm," he said quietly. The queen joined him, her golden eyes reflecting the light. "Not just a storm," she said. "That is fire." The smell reached them moments later, sharp and acrid. Somewhere beyond the hills, something burned, and the wind was carrying it toward the village. She moved to a cabinet and pulled out a small black case. Inside lay an ornate dagger, its blade etched with markings that seemed to move under the light. She handed it to him without explanation. He took it, feeling its strange weight. "If we are to fight," she said, "you will need this." He turned the weapon in his hands, the etchings catching the last light of day. The storm outside was growing closer. The wind grew stronger, carrying the smell of burning wood, and something far worse. The human stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The red glow had spread, licking the edges of the hills in the distance. The queen stood beside him, her long hair moving in the gusts. She did not look afraid, but her jaw was set in quiet tension. In the village square, people had begun to gather. Some carried buckets, others crude weapons. The air was thick with unease. A man approached the queen, his eyes darting to the human before speaking. "The fires are not natural," he said. "They move too fast." She asked where they began, and his answer made her eyes narrow. "The old watchtowers," he told her. "The ones we abandoned years ago." The human asked how far the towers were. The man hesitated, then said they stood at the border between the village lands and the dead plains. The queen met the human's gaze. "They are sending a message," she said. He understood without asking who they were. Whoever had thrown her into the pit had now set their eyes on the village. This was not a warning. It was the first strike. The queen moved quickly, ordering the villagers to form lines to protect the homes nearest to the fire's path. Some obeyed without question, others stared at her with doubt. The human began gathering buckets alongside the others, his movements calm but fast. When one man muttered about trusting someone who had been in the pit, the human's eyes fixed on him until the man looked away. By the time the fire reached the edge of the fields, the heat was fierce. Flames danced in long waves, consuming dry grass and wooden fences. The villagers worked in frantic rhythm, throwing water and beating the smaller fires with wet cloth. The human moved through the smoke without pause, dragging buckets and pulling people out of danger. The queen directed them from the highest point, her voice carrying over the roar. Then came the shapes in the smoke. At first they looked like shadows, but when the wind shifted, the truth was clear. Figures in black armor moved among the flames, their movements controlled and deliberate. They were not there to put the fire out. They were there to spread it. The queen's hand went to the dagger at her side, and the human drew his sword in answer. The first clash was sudden. A black-armored attacker lunged at the queen, but the human intercepted, his blade striking with precision. The fight was short, ending with the attacker on the ground. Another came from the side, and she met them herself, moving with a speed that belied her days in chains. The villagers froze for a moment, watching her fight, then returned to their Work with renewed urgency. The firelight cast the battle in harsh gold and deep shadow. Each strike from the human cut through the enemy lines. Each movement from the queen was measured and lethal. Still, the attackers pressed forward, forcing them toward the heart of the village. The smell of burning oil grew stronger, and the human realized they were not just burning fields, they were setting traps. When a barrel near one of the homes ignited, the explosion sent embers across the square. The human shielded 2 children from the blast, then turned to see the queen facing 3 armored figures alone. He moved to her side, the dagger she had given him flashing in his offhand. Together they fought in a rhythm that needed no words, each movement protecting the other. By the time the last attacker fell, the fires had been beaten back to the edges of the fields. The villagers were exhausted, their faces streaked with soot. But their homes still stood. The queen lowered her weapon slowly, her breathing even. She looked at the human, her eyes holding something new, an unspoken understanding that their fates were now tied. The night air was thick with smoke, but it carried the sound of victory. The fires burned low now, sending thin streams of smoke into the night sky. The villagers moved slowly, their bodies heavy from the long fight. The human stood near the well, wiping the blood from his blade. The queen approached him, her steps quiet against the stone. Her golden eyes studied his face for a long moment before she spoke. "You fight as if you have done it your whole life," she said. He glanced at her, his expression calm. "I fight when I must," he replied. She tilted her head slightly, as if the answer told her more than he intended. Around them, people began to gather again, but this time their faces held less fear and more respect. The air felt different now. An older man stepped forward, leaning on a carved staff. "We owe you both our lives," he said, "but they will come again." The queen's eyes narrowed. "They will," she agreed. "And when they do, they will bring more than fire." The human listened without speaking, his mind already turning over the next steps they would need to take. He knew this was not finished. The villagers began repairing what had been damaged. Buckets were refilled, fences pulled upright, and burnt. Grass dug out to prevent the fire from returning. The human joined in without being asked, moving heavy beams and carrying water. The queen also worked beside them, her hands steady and strong. For the first time, the people saw her not as a ruler or a prisoner, but as one of them. As the night deepened, a cold wind moved through the streets. The queen led the human to the edge of the village, where the land opened to rolling plains. In the distance, the faint glow of campfires dotted the horizon. "That is where they wait," she said. He studied the lights for a long time, measuring their number and distance. "Too many to face alone," he said. She gave a short nod. They returned to her house, where the weapons they had carried lay across the table. The queen unrolled a piece of worn cloth, revealing a map drawn in sharp lines. She pointed to a narrow pass in the hills beyond the plains. "This is where they must come through," she explained. "If we can hold this point, the village will be safe." The human traced the route with his finger, memorizing the terrain. "Who else will fight?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Enough," she said, though her voice carried no certainty. "Some will stand with us because they must. Others will need a reason." He understood her meaning. Fear alone would not make them fight. They would need hope, and perhaps something more. He set his jaw. "Then we give them one," he said. By morning, the village was awake again. The queen called a meeting in the square, standing tall despite the smoke stains on her armor. The human stood beside her, silent but watchful. She spoke clearly, telling them of the campfires on the plains and the enemy's path. Her voice carried strength, but also a challenge. "If we do nothing, we will burn," she told them. "If we stand together, we can break them." Some looked away, others clenched their fists. The human watched as her words began to settle over the crowd. A young man stepped forward, then another. Soon, a dozen stood with them. It was not everyone, but it was enough to start. The Queen's gaze met the humans for a brief second, and he saw the faintest trace of relief in her eyes. When the meeting ended, they began preparing. Weapons were sharpened, armor repaired, and supplies gathered. The Queen oversaw the organization, while the human moved among the fighters, offering quiet instructions. The air in the village was no longer heavy with fear. Instead, it carried the weight of coming battle. The night before had changed them all, and now they were ready to face what lay ahead. The sun was still low when the fighters gathered at the edge of the village. The Queen stood before them, her crimson skin catching the pale light. The human moved quietly among the group, checking straps, blades, and shields. The air carried the scent of the burned fields from the night before, a sharp reminder of why they were leaving. No one spoke more than needed. They began their march toward the hills. The path cut through tall grass that swayed in the wind, hiding the earth beneath. The Queen walked at the front, her eyes never leaving the horizon. The human stayed a few paces behind, his senses tuned to every sound. Birds moved in the distance, their calls quick and nervous. The wind felt heavier here. When they reached the narrow pass marked on the map, the Queen stopped. The cliffs on either side rose high, their shadows stretching across the ground. "This is where we hold them," she said. The human walked the length of the pass, testing the ground underfoot. Loose stones shifted near the edges, but the center was solid. It was the kind of ground where a smaller force could stand against many. The villagers began placing barricades, made of stone and wood. The human helped lift heavy logs into place, driving them deep into the earth. The Queen gave instructions with short, clear words, and the people followed without hesitation. Every barrier built here would slow the enemy and give them a better chance. By the time the sun reached its height, the pass looked less like a path and more like a trap. They rested briefly in the shade of the cliffs. The human sat with his back to the rock, sharpening his blade with slow, even strokes. The Queen stood nearby, watching the horizon. "They will come soon," she said. He looked up at her. "Then we are ready." She gave a small nod, but her gaze stayed fixed on the distance. Her hand rested lightly on the hilt of her dagger. A sudden call came from one of the watchpoints. Shapes were moving on the plains beyond the pass. The human rose, scanning the distant figures. The black armor was unmistakable. They moved in lines, steady and unhurried, as if certain of their victory. The Queen walked to the center of the barricades, her voice carrying. "Positions," she commanded. The fighters obeyed. The enemy reached the mouth of the pass and slowed. For a moment, the two sides faced each other in silence. Then a horn sounded, deep and long. The human's grip on his sword tightened. The first wave surged forward, their boots pounding against the ground. Arrows from the villagers flew into their ranks, dropping several before they reached the barricades. The clash began with the sound of steel on steel. The human moved through the fight like a shadow, striking where the line was weakest. The Queen fought beside him, her dagger quick and deadly. The narrow pass kept the enemy from surrounding them, but still they pushed hard. The air was filled with the shouts of the fighters and the sharp ring of metal. Every step forward by the enemy was met with fierce resistance. A break formed on the left side. The human saw it and moved quickly, cutting down two attackers before they could break through. Blood ran across the rocks, making the ground slick. The Queen called out orders to tighten the line. The villagers responded, driving the enemy back with renewed force. The fight was far from over, but they held their ground. When the first wave fell back, the pass was littered with bodies. The human stood breathing hard, his blade red. The Queen's eyes met his, and there was no need for words. They had stopped the first assault, but the enemy was regrouping beyond the barricades. The wind carried the low sound of another horn. The second wave was coming, and the real test had just begun. The second wave advanced with a heavier sound. The human could feel the vibration in the ground beneath his boots. The queen stood ready at the center, her dagger catching the light. The villagers tightened their grips on their weapons, their breathing fast but steady. The pass seemed to grow narrower as the enemy closed in. This time, the attackers carried shields. They moved in a wall, blocking the arrows that rained down on them. The human stepped forward, meeting the first with a hard strike that sent him stumbling back. The clash spread across the barricade, wood splintering under the force of the fight. The queen moved with precision, each strike finding a gap in the enemy's guard. A group of black armored soldiers pushed toward the right flank. The human saw them and crossed the field in quick, powerful strides. He met them head-on, his sword cutting through shield and armor. The ground was slick with dirt and blood, but he did not falter. The queen's voice carried over the noise, directing fighters to hold the center. Her commands kept the line from breaking. The sound of the battle echoed between the cliffs. The enemy pressed hard, their numbers seeming endless. The villagers fought with desperate strength, driving them back inch by inch. The human's movements were sharp and controlled, his strikes clean. He fought as if every breath counted, and perhaps it did. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. A cry went up from the left. One of the barricades had been breached. The queen rushed toward it, her dagger flashing in the dim light. The human followed, cutting down 2 attackers in his path. Together, they closed the gap, forcing the enemy to retreat. The breach was sealed again, but the cost was high. Several villagers lay wounded on the ground. They had no time to move the injured. Another push came from the front, stronger than before. The human planted his feet, meeting the first blow with his blade. Sparks flew as steel struck steel. The queen fought beside him, their movements in perfect rhythm. Each time one stepped forward, the other covered the flank. The enemy could not break them apart. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pass. The enemy's armor gleamed in the fading light, but their movements slowed. The human could see their exhaustion. The queen pressed the advantage, calling for the fighters to push forward. Step by step, they drove the enemy back toward the mouth of the pass. The air was filled with the sound of retreating boots. When the second wave finally withdrew, the fighters stood breathing hard. The human lowered his blade, but kept it ready. The queen's gaze swept the field, taking in the fallen and the living. She nodded once, a silent signal to begin tending to the wounded. The villagers moved quickly, carrying the injured to the safety of the inner barricades. The ground was marked by the cost of holding the pass. The human took a drink from a water skin, the cool liquid cutting through the dust in his throat. The queen joined him, her eyes still fixed on the enemy's position beyond the pass. "They will not stop here," she said. He agreed with a small nod. The sound of distant movement carried on the wind, low and steady. Another wave was gathering, and the night was not far away. They knew the next assault could decide everything. The fighters sharpened their weapons again, repaired what they could of the barricades, and took what rest was possible. The queen stood at the highest point of the pass, the human beside her. The light was fading fast, but their resolve held. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Night fell heavy over the pass. The only light came from the scattered torches and the faint glow of the enemy's campfires beyond the cliffs. The human stood with his blade in hand, his eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. The queen moved beside him, her presence calm but sharp with focus. The fighters waited in silence, each breath slow and steady. The third wave came without warning. No horn sounded this time. The enemy emerged from the darkness in swift silence, their armor blending with the night. The first clash was sudden, steel ringing loud against steel. The human stepped into the fight without hesitation, meeting the charge with a strike that dropped the first attacker. The queen was already at his side, her dagger flashing in quick arcs. The narrow pass trapped the enemy's numbers, forcing them into close combat. The villagers fought with every ounce of strength left in them. The human moved like a shadow through the fray, his strikes precise and deadly. The queen's movements were a mirror to his, each action covering the other's defense. The fight was brutal, but the defenders held their ground. An enemy captain pushed forward, taller and stronger than the rest. His weapon was a heavy axe that tore through the first barricade with a single blow. The human met him head-on, their blades striking with force that shook the air. The captain pressed hard, but the human did not give an inch. With a final powerful strike, he drove his sword through the man's armor, ending the threat. The enemy faltered at the sight of their captain falling. The queen saw the hesitation and called for a full push. The fighters surged forward with renewed strength, forcing the enemy back step by step. The sound of retreat filled the pass. The human pressed the attack, driving them past the mouth of the pass and into open ground where their formation broke apart. In the open, the enemy could not match the defenders' speed. The queen moved through their ranks with precision, her strikes cutting deep. The human fought at her side, his blade finding every weakness. Soon the field was littered with fallen black-armored bodies. The remaining enemy fled toward the distant campfires, their discipline broken. The defenders stopped at the edge of the plains, their breathing heavy but their stance proud. Silence settled over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of distant fires. The human lowered his sword, the weight of the fight still heavy in his arms. The queen stepped closer, her golden eyes fixed on him. "It is over," she said. He nodded once, knowing the words were true. The pass was theirs, and the village beyond was safe. When they returned, the villagers greeted them not with fear, but with respect. Fires were lit in the square, not for warning but for celebration. The wounded were tended to, and the dead were honored with quiet ceremony. The human stood apart at first, watching the people gather around the queen. She moved among them with grace, speaking to each fighter and worker who had stood with them. Later, when the noise had softened and the fires burned low, the queen found him at the edge of the village. "You came into the pit alone," she said. "Now you leave with more than you entered." He looked at her, seeing not a prisoner or a ruler, but an equal. She extended her hand, and after a moment, he took it. In that simple gesture, something unspoken passed between them. From that night forward, the human was no longer an outsider. The queen's word became law, and his presence at her side became part of it. Together, they led the village into a new strength, one built not on fear but on trust. The death pit was still there, deep and silent, but it was no longer a place of endings. It was the place where a queen and a human began.